Hi everyone, welcome to this online talk with V&A Dundee. My name is Nicole Keane and I'm the creative programmer here. Tonight we are very happy to be joined by Alice Rawsthorne to hear about her collaborative project Design Emergency. This will be followed by an audience Q&A. Before I welcome on our director Leonie Bell for a short introduction, I just wanted to draw your attention to some of the Zoom functions we're going to use tonight. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the talk using the Q&A function, and we're going to address those at the end. If you'd like to use the closed caption function, please enable this on your bottom bar of your Zoom window. Details on how to use all these features have been posted in the chat for you. And finally, if you are going to talk about this event online, which we definitely encourage, please do tag us at VA Dundee. Without further ado, I'm just going to invite the director of V&A Dundee, Leonie Bell, on to join us.
Muted and somebody else was controlling my video, so I'm here. Thank you, Nicole, for introducing and settling us all in this evening. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Just want to offer you a really warm welcome from what actually is a very cold Dundee. I noticed somebody else who's in Dundee tonight saying that it was sunny. It's been miserable here for the past few days, freezing and really awful sleet and hailstones. And we're absolutely delighted with the turnout for tonight. It's lovely seeing everybody's comments popping up saying where you're all coming from. In these times of being apart, it's really lovely to know where you all are. And we think we've got guests joining us from all over the world. But looking like there's quite a strong Edinburgh and Fife contingent as well. So welcome to everybody, no matter where you are in the world. And thank you also to our members and donors, many of whom have also joined us tonight. We're ever so grateful for everybody's support of the museum now more than ever in these really, really difficult times for everybody in the cultural sector. And although our doors in Dundee remain closed, it's so good to know that so many of you are joining us tonight. And we're really looking forward to being able to welcome you back into V&A Dundee again, or for the first time in better days. And we're all pretty sure they're coming soon. As Nicole says, we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Alice Rawsthorne tonight. Alice is many, many things, but mainly known for being an award-winning design critic and author. Her books include Hello World, Where Design Meets Life, and more recently, Design is Attitude. But over and above this, or because of this, Alice is a really powerful voice and advocate for design and architecture, and I think really critically for designers and architects as well. Through her talks, her research, her writing, and her phenomenal social media content. Please do follow her on Twitter and Instagram if you don't already. She cuts through with unbelievable precision the many misconceptions that exist around design being a superficial pursuit. And she positions it as one of the most powerful and empowering resources that we have as humankind. And one of the things that I really enjoy about Alice's writing and her Instagram posts is the way that design is described as a means to create change. Design should help us. It shouldn't hinder us. And she describes it as a way that we can bring hope, optimism, and joy to the most difficult situations and contexts. And actually, Alice has been with us a couple of times before in better days when she could join us in V&A Dundee. And 2 years ago, she gave a talk, which is available online, about her brilliant book, Design is Attitude. And I was reading the text about it today and listening back earlier on, and the way we described that talk in January 2019 was to describe the ways that design and architecture were approaching what we thought then were really turbulent times, and how designers and architects were dealing with change and challenge, and a lot of it centered around the climate emergency, refugee crisis, and deepening local and global inequalities. And 2 years on, we're living in even more turbulent times, but those challenges of 2 years ago remain, and if anything, they are deepened and they are heightened, and they're laid bare before us. Alice is joining us tonight from London to talk about something that she established with Viola Antonelli during lockdown called Design Emergency. And it's a research platform. And Design Emergency explores design's role along with science, technology, and nature, and how we can work through and emerge from this global, yet very locally and domestically lived public health crisis. V&A Dundee's also been really interested in this. And we explored this in an exhibition that we opened last year in August with called Now Accepting Contactless. An absolute first for us. Not sure it's something the team want to repeat again. It was an exhibition entirely curated and designed in lockdown and about lockdown. There is very little, if anything, about our collective and individual experience of the pandemic that has not in some way been touched and shaped by design. And as I was saying, the pandemic has laid bare where design assists, but also it's heightened and exposed where we have inequality and design inequality too. Design emergency also asks if design can plot a path forward from the pandemic, and if it, alongside this, can create a turning point in how we address those existing issues of inequality and climate change and many others. And for me, design emergency is one of these really rare things that we're all grasping in these really difficult times. It manages to be both urgent and generous, really, really serious, and yet ever so hopeful. Alice, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Leonie. And I only wish I was with you all in Dundee this evening, freezing, whether the weather is or not. It's such a wonderful city, and I'm so looking forward to going back there. And thank you very much to the whole V&A Dundee team for inviting me to give another talk for the museum, and particularly at this very ominous, but as Leonie says, increasingly optimistic time. So I'm going to talk about design emergency, and you'll have to bear with me while I share the screen. And we'll just go to a full screen. Here we go. So I've been invited to talk about one of the major design challenges of this particular very strange time. And it is, of course, design's role in the COVID-19 pandemic. What's worked, what hasn't worked, and what it means for public perceptions of design, and the role that it's likely to play post-pandemic when, as we hope, our lives will be redesigned and reconstructed, ideally to make them fit for purpose for the future. And I started to map the design response to COVID-19 at the start of the first UK lockdown in March last year. And I began in a very simple way by devoting a week of daily posts on my Instagram to design in a pandemic. That was the theme for the week. And I planned to do it just for that week, because I usually have weekly themes. But by the end of the week, I'd spotted so many incredible COVID-19 related design projects, I decided to go on for another week and then to continue on an ad hoc basis for several months. I think there were 70 plus posts by the end. And of course, by then, design had become a major COVID-19 news story for the general media. And this was largely because ingenious and resourceful designers were developing amazing innovations on many different scales, but always at great speed. But also because the media and the public were desperate for good news stories and for glimmers of hope and optimism in an otherwise terrifying situation. Ideally, this should have come from the medical and scientific breakthroughs in the treatment of COVID-19, which of course will drive our path out of the pandemic. But very little was known about the disease at the time, and the scientific innovations we really needed, vaccines, were months, or as we feared, maybe even years away. So in that context, media reports of the design of new ventilators, personal protective equipment, data dashboards and data trackers and so on were incredibly reassuring and allowed us to think that we were making progress in controlling and eventually curbing the spread of this deadly infection. So for me, this was incredibly exciting as someone who's argued for years that design should be empowered to play a more ambitious and eclectic role in our lives by tackling urgent and complex social, political, economic and ecological problems, as Leonie alluded to. And my great friend and fellow design obsessive, Paola Antonelli, Senior Curator of Design at MoMA in New York, will be participating in a future event in this series for V&A Dundee, agreed with me that COVID-19 could be a game changer for public and political perceptions of design. And Paola suggested that we should work together to encourage this. And as we'd always wanted to collaborate, going further than just roping one another into all our projects, I of course enthusiastically agreed. So in early May, Paola and I, helped by our friend, the graphic designer Frith Kerr of Studio Frith, launched an Instagram platform, Design Emergency. Here's part of the early grid for it, to investigate design's response to COVID-19. And we decided to begin with weekly IG Live interviews with the designers who we believed were at the forefront of the relief effort, and to address this globally. So since last summer, we've had a new focus, which is interviewing the global leaders of what promises to be the massive redesign programme as COVID-19 infections decline. But looking at the first part of Design Emergency, the design response to COVID-19, which I'm going to focus on this evening, what were the key design developments? Now, Paola and I were absolutely spoilt for choice, largely because designers, architects, engineers, coders, and their collaborators were displaying such courage, creativity, ingenuity, resourcefulness, and flair in tackling COVID-19 from the outset. It was evident, as I've said, that medical and scientific innovations were the key solutions, but the way in which they applied was the job of design, and it was a critically important one. So I'm going to look at different types of standout design responses that Paola and I identified, starting by addressing the fundamental question of what is COVID-19. Now, it's important to remember that even the world's greatest epidemiologists couldn't have answered that question, nor could I have pronounced epidemiologist, of course, at the start of the pandemic. But towards the end of January last year, there was just enough information about the mysterious new infection, about its genetic coding, for the medical illustrators, the specialist designers who visualize new diseases, to go to work. And two medical illustrators at the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, Alyssa Eckert and Dan Higgins, were charged with the task of creating the official US medical illustration for SARS-CoV-2, the source of COVID-19. And this was on the 21st of January, the day after the CDC activated its Emergency Response Center for COVID-19, really raising the alarm that this wasn't a regional epidemic, it was a potential global pandemic. 10 days later, Alyssa and Dan had completed, signed off and launched a detailed visualization of SARS-CoV-2, which very soon we would all recognize worldwide as this, the famous spiky blob. Now, scientific illustrations, medical illustrations like this one, have to be scientifically precise. If they weren't, they wouldn't have any credibility. But their designers, the illustrators, always have some scope for expressiveness, generally to fulfill specific criteria. And in this instance, the CDC, which was very concerned at the public seeming lack of awareness or curiosity, or indeed concern about the new infection, they wanted them to ensure that the medical illustration would signal that this was something to A, take seriously, and B, be genuinely frightened of. So Alyssa and Dan exaggerated the scariest element of SARS-CoV-2, and these are the most visible proteins on the surface of the sphere, the spike or S proteins, and these really are the scariest aspect of the genetic coding, because they're the aspect of SARS-CoV-2 that spread contagion by attaching it to human cells, thereby spreading COVID-19. And they did this by making them more numerous than they are in real life, bigger and spikier, and in this lurid, rather scary shade of blood red. And it worked. The spiky blob is something that we immediately recognize as scary. It's among the most ubiquitous images of our time and became thus with equally scarily high speed. Many aspects of COVID-19 remain baffling to eminent scientists, and its full name is still inscrutable: severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, but we all know what it looks like, or we think that we do, thanks to Alyssa and Dan's medical illustration. And as Alyssa said when I interviewed her for a Design Emergency IG Live, it gave a face to the unknown. Now, equally fascinating was the speed and relish with which the rest of us, global citizens, projected our emotions onto Alyssa and Dan's illustration. A key element of all truly iconographic images that people feel impelled to do this, initially by illustrating our fears of COVID-19 and its deadly consequences. Now, the media, of course, played on this. I mean, the spiky blob is a satirist and cartoonist dream, with endless cartoons and caricatures of ultra-destructive spiky blobs. Some of my favourites are these Economist covers, on which it appears first as a crushing weight on the global economy, and then as missiles blasting through the Union Jack flag. As an aside, one of my favourite weekly design reads is an e-newsletter from The Economist, which is the description of the design process of developing the cover each week. And Zanny Minton Beddoes, the editor-in-chief, goes into great detail about the design decisions that were taken to come up with the right cover, includes illustrations of cover ideas that were scrapped, and explains why. So as a sort of forensic description of the design process, it's absolutely brilliant, always fascinating, always educative. But many of the most compelling design interpretations of the spiky blob have been made not by designers, like The Economist's illustrators and graphic designers, but by people who've used their instinctive design skills to help them to deal with a major global crisis in which they'd otherwise feel powerless. And examples of these: this is a police officer in the Indian city of Chennai, wearing the temporary uniform that was given to this officer and fellow officers by the local police force in the early months of the pandemic. The spiky blobbed helmet, the shield, the slants, I mean, it's all very Game of Thrones, sort of goes Afrofuturistic and spiky blobbed. They were all designed and made by local artist Gautam, who equipped a group of police officers with this kit. And the idea was that they would patrol around Chennai, as you can see this officer doing, to raise awareness of the dangers of the spiky blob of COVID-19 and to ensure that people followed the rules and took it as a serious threat that they needed to guard themselves against. But perhaps predictably, we also soon succumb to the desire to cutesify the spiky blob, presumably but in an attempt to try and convince us that it wasn't quite so terrifying after all, and that maybe we could just control it. And this was evident in a flood of replica cupcakes, beach balls, and fluffy toys. One of my favourite examples are these coronavirus braid hairdos, which apparently were the latest fashion for girls like these, modelling them brilliantly in Nairobi in Kenya, and a local beauty salon specialised in coronavirus braids. But both responses to the spiky blob, the scary and the sentimental, collided in these. A trend worldwide for people to make their own coronavirus piñatas, which, as you can see, this girl in Australia is smashing up with great glee in her garden. So then Para and I looked at another critically important role of design in a devastating global health crisis like this, which is how can design help us to treat COVID-19 more efficiently? Now, this has, of course, taken many forms, starting with the speedy redesign of existing hospitals and clinics to provide them with enough fully equipped beds and critical care wards for COVID-19 patients, and also to separate them from other patients with other conditions to reduce the spread of infection. And the equally rapid conversion of other buildings, from museums to convention centres, into hospitals either to treat COVID-19 or to deal with other medical issues. And at the forefront of this process have been a phenomenal group of humanitarian architects in Boston, Massachusetts, in the United States, Mass Design Group, who, long before we'd ever heard of COVID-19, were already working on infection-proofed healthcare facilities, many of them in vulnerable parts of the world, like this beautiful district hospital in Butaro in Rwanda. And Mass were commissioned by the Rwandan government after the Ebola crisis in Rwanda to advise them on how to design a new national healthcare network that would be fit for purpose to help to curb future infections and to provide the quality of healthcare and the level of accessibility to healthcare that they wanted their citizens to have. So the Butaro District Hospital, which was completed 5 or 6 years ago, was of course in prime position because infection proofing was absolutely central to Mass's design scheme. So this was speedily converted into the primary COVID care centre for the district, and Mass continued to advise the Rwandan government on how to adapt other buildings. And as it had also worked in Haiti following the devastating cholera outbreak there after the earthquake, MAS, whose declared mission is to research, build and advocate for architecture that promotes justice and human dignity, began the pandemic by again converting its recently completed cholera care centre in Port-au-Prince in Haiti, which you can see on the screen, again into Haiti's primary COVID-19 care centre. And it has subsequently advised hospitals throughout the United States and elsewhere on how to adapt their facilities for COVID treatment, starting with Mount Sinai Hospital in New York. But design innovations have also been critical in reducing COVID patients and indeed other patients' reliance on traditional building-based healthcare in equally ambitious and innovative projects such as this one. This is Sehat Kahani, one of its local clinics in Pakistan, and it's a phenomenal telemedical network in Pakistan, a country of 200 million people, fewer than half of whom have access to healthcare. And the lack of availability of healthcare is even worse for women than it is for men. And two Pakistani doctors based in Karachi, Sara Saeed Karam, who you can see second from left on the screen, and her great friend and fellow doctor, Ifat Zafar Aga, founded Sehat Kahani 5 years ago to use telemedicine as a solution to the dearth of accessible healthcare for women throughout Pakistan. Now, Pakistan suffers from an acute shortage of women doctors, even though there are more female medical students at medical schools and universities than men. This is because once they graduate, they come under acute family and social pressure to marry, have children, and stop working, becoming what are called doctor brides. And this was, in fact, what happened to Sarah and Ifat. They decided that they were going to use their instinctive design flair to address the problem of the dearth of available healthcare for women by developing a network of e-clinics that would mobilise fellow doctor brides like themselves by enabling them to practice from their homes, examining patients who'd be in local clinics in small towns and villages throughout the country, attended by local nurses, and to advise them through live video links, and then to liaise with the local nurses on the patient's treatment. Now, the concept was, of course, tested thoroughly in Pakistan, and it encountered lots of initial problems, as you'd expect, ranging from inadequate electricity supplies in many rural clinics, leading to power failures. A common problem was that many of the patients, particularly elderly ones, found it difficult to believe that the nice young women who were talking to them on the screen really were qualified to treat them. But Sehat Kahani gradually found solutions to all these problems, and the network expanded throughout Pakistan. In 2019, Sehat Kahani also launched an app to offer instant advice to patients throughout the country. And when COVID-19 struck, Sarah and Ifat immediately reinvented their service to treat coronavirus throughout Pakistan, as well as continuing to deliver general medical advice. And critically, they won the government's approval to do so. And this, in a patriarchal, male-dominated country, was quite extraordinary because the women-led nature of Sehat Kahani had aroused fierce criticism in the early years, but the incredible dynamism and efficiency of Sehat Kahani during COVID-19 has been a game changer for them in terms of public and political perceptions. Sehat Kahani has more than quadrupled its capacity in the last year since the start of the pandemic, creating a fully national network of e-clinics and access to online advice. It currently employs over 5,000 female doctors, most of them doctor brides, but some who continue to practice. It runs 32 community e-health clinics throughout Pakistan and is treating over 3 million patients, a phenomenal achievement. By delivering practical proof of the efficacy of telemedicine, and I would say of improvisational design, Sehat Kahani has sealed its reputation in Pakistan and is now planning to expand in other South Asian countries. And COVID-19 has accelerated the development of telemedicine worldwide, including here in the UK, where the NHS has adopted it with vigour. But it's heartening to see that thanks to the courage, determination, and improvisational design ingenuity of these two doctors, Pakistan is in the vanguard. Now for one of the noisiest and most contentious areas of the design response to COVID-19, the global race to design and build new ventilators like these in Wuhan, particularly to address the dire shortage for critical care patients everywhere but Southeast Asia and Germany. Now, this brought out both the best and the worst in the hundreds of designers, engineers, manufacturers, and entrepreneurs who immediately announced that they were going to design ventilators, with the showiest among them claiming that their ventilators were going to be designed faster and were going to be better than all of the rest. Now, it seems apt that almost all of the biggest braggarts failed, because designing critical care ventilators to meet exacting medical standards turned out to be much, much more difficult than the design teams at luxury car marques, Formula One teams, and of course Elon Musk had ever imagined. And tellingly, the most successful attempts have tended to be more modest ones, and also pragmatic initiatives, typically collaborations with specialists from different fields with relevant areas of expertise, who focused on hacking existing systems rather than designing new ones from scratch, by using standardized components wherever possible, and critically by sharing design information with other designers to speed up other design processes all over the world. And many of the smartest ideas didn't come from designers at all, but from healthcare professionals, like this one. This is Marco Ranieri, who Paola, who you may have guessed from her name, is Italian, of course with great patriotic pride, interviewed for Design Emergency, and he is head of critical care at Bologna's biggest public hospital. And he realised very early on in the crisis that every critical care ventilator has enough capacity to treat more than 2 patients at a time rather than just one. So Dr. Ranieri collaborated with a friend, a local industrial designer in Bologna, to design this double-headed nozzle that you can see him holding proudly on the screen. And this was a device that enabled 2 patients to be ventilated at the same time, and it has been imitated all over the world and made increasingly sophisticated ever since he first introduced it. But I also have tremendous admiration for the resourceful and responsible designers in fragile parts of the world, in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, where there are severe ventilator shortages. And Paola, my favourite example is this one. These are the Afghan Dreamers, 5 teenage girls aged from 15 to 18 in Afghanistan, all of whom are STAR Tech students, members of the Afghan Dreamers robotics team, who have spent most of the last year designing and building 2 emergency ventilators in Herat, the city where they live, using recycled components, including Toyota Corolla car parts. They've done so under incredible pressure of lockdown, acute supply shortages in Afghanistan, spikes in COVID-19 infections, their families' fear for their safety at a time of renewed Taliban violence in the city. But courageously, they persisted. They first won local government support for their project, and then, like Zahat Kahani, they won over the national government. So this is a project that was fully realised. They had significant technical problems, particularly in terms of getting the right components. But again, it was heartening to see how designers all over the world rallied to help them and made sure that they got the key components that they needed. It's also been heartening to see how designers all over the world have adopted the open source process used by the successful ventilator designers elsewhere, which involves posting up the outcomes, their design templates and specifications, to be downloaded free by anyone anywhere who can make good use of them. And this is also applied to the designers and makers of clinical equipment and of masks, gowns, gloves, and other personal protective equipment for frontline health and social care workers. And the most successful of these projects have also been pragmatic, collaborative, and open to sharing their work and ideas in a collective spirit of mutual support, rather than swaggering competitiveness. And a great example is Creatives Tegen Corona, CTC, which is a large collective of friends working in the fashion and design industries in Antwerp, Belgium, who very early in the first lockdown decided that they wanted wanted to pool their skills, their networks and their resources to help Belgium's COVID health effort. Now, CTC is an incredibly efficient and well-resourced project that produced highly sophisticated PPE for Belgian care workers with patterns designed by this woman, who's Dries van Noten, the fashion designer's pattern cutter. The specifications were, of course, posted online, and they've been downloaded thousands of times by designers and makers all over the world: Brazil, India, Kenya, Morocco, and many other countries. But another critically important role of design in a crisis like this is informing us about the pandemic and advising us on how we should behave. And this, of course, has been a traditional role for design throughout many global emergencies, whether it's wartime, past pandemics and epidemics, and so on. These are old-fashioned public information programs, which are as important during COVID-19, albeit on very different communications platforms, as they've ever been. And ideally, a public information programme addressing a dire and grave emergency like this one must be as clear, precise and coherent as possible. Now, I don't know about Scotland. I only hope that your public information programme has been more efficient than ours in England, which has been exactly the opposite: chaotic, confusing and counterproductive. And sadly, the same can be said for the programmes in many other countries. But one campaign internationally stands out as a resounding success, and it's this one: Unite Against COVID-19, which was designed by the Clemenger BBDO marketing agency in Wellington for the New Zealand government. Now, like the spiky blob medical illustration, it had to be put together at unprecedented speed in just 6 days from briefing to launch at the start of the pandemic. It's been continually redefined, refined and adapted ever since. Every aspect of this public information programme, the fonts, the pictograms, the colours, the graphics, is legible, accessible and friendly without ever detracting from the tragedy of the situation. The visual consistency, the black, white and yellow palette, the hazard tape diagonal stripes that allude to the urgent nature of the crisis make it instantly recognisable in whatever media it's on: social media, digital billboards, newspaper ads, whatever. And together with the text, they always reinforce the theme of unity, that New Zealanders are all in this together and will end it together, if everyone pitches in and obeys the rules and helps everybody else out. Now, for example, the pictograms, and you can see some of them here, always display a useful activity and the spirit of the campaign. So you have someone coughing into their elbow and washing their hands as soon as they get home or arrive in a new place. And Mark Dalton, who's the creative director of Clemenger BBDO and of the Unite Against COVID-19 public information campaign, said when I interviewed him for Design Emergency, if you're trying to help people, the last thing you want to say is don't do this. You must tell them something they can do for help. And even if it's as simple as sneezing into your elbow, it really can help. But there are many other COVID-19 information design coups that relate to data, because this is a time when not only is more data available than ever before, but thanks to technological advances, designers are developing ever more sophisticated ways of interpreting and presenting it. So data design has been a real star of this crisis. You can take the track and tracing apps, which have proved critical in stopping the speed of infection in the Southeast Asian countries that tend to have fared best in controlling the pandemic, like China, Singapore, South Korea and Taiwan, and have also played a key element in enabling Israel to have by far the most efficient and effective COVID-19 vaccination program so far anywhere in the world, with 20 million people already vaccinated, 20% of the country already vaccinated. Although the bickering over many of these data programs and devices and systems has at times been reminiscent of that in the ventilator design race. So absolutely key to enabling us to follow the spread of the pandemic are data dashboards like this one, which have become incredibly popular. I've got lots of friends who seem to spend all day poring over their favourites. And this is a sort of grandeur to the ominous grise of data dashboards. It's It's the COVID Global Case Tracker, an interactive map that was designed by a team at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, in the United States. And it does exactly what its name suggests by compiling live data from diverse global sources to analyze the pandemic's impact in each place. And the Johns Hopkins Global Case Tracker was downloaded over 1 billion times in its first month alone, and has become an absolutely integral tool for many people in this crisis. But there's also a new kid on the block in terms of data dashboards, and it's this one. Rather more utilitarian, but very zippy and nippy data dashboard. And it was designed by Avi Schiffman, a 17-year-old high school student from Mercer Island, Washington State in the US. And he started in late December 2019, when he was becoming increasingly curious about the reports of the mysterious new Chinese disease and increasingly frustrated by the lack of US government information about it. So Avi scraped the data off Asian sites, helped by fellow high school students, most of whom were living in Asia, and he'd encountered online. But another data design winner during the pandemic has been data visualization, an increasingly important area of design, an increasingly creative area of design in recent years that has absolutely come into its own during the crisis. And in the forefront is the Italian data designer Federica Fragapane, who Paola has interviewed on Design Emergency, who produced an incredible series of data visualization projects that explore COVID-19's response to vulnerability by analysing its cruel and brutal, remorseless propensity to prey on the most vulnerable members of society, which for me is really one of the most violent and troubling aspects of this pandemic, that our weakest neighbours suffer the most. And this means vulnerability in terms of anything: physical and mental health, wealth, age, ethnicity, the quality of people's homes, the quality and otherwise of their environment. And Federica was commissioned by the Sergo Foundation, a non-profit foundation, to map the relationship between COVID-19 and vulnerability, to prove in her visualizations that there really was a causal link between the two. So of course, this was a time when many politicians, particularly in the US, were questioning this. And when she was being interviewed by Paola, she described her role in projects like this one as being to talk about the complexity of the topic without losing the humanity behind it. And she has done so beautifully in an extraordinary series of these data visualizations. And I'd urge you all, if you're interested, to follow her on Instagram, because she's always posting up about her new projects, and they're always fascinating. But the empathy and generosity that are reflected in Federica's work are also invoked in some of the most effective improvisational design responses to COVID-19, and my own personal favourites. And these are what we can broadly call community-spirited projects. These are the volunteer networks that have sprung up nationally, regionally, globally, and locally to provide practical help, whether it's in mass production of PPE in the way that the CTC volunteers were doing, or people in local communities arranging to help their vulnerable neighbours and using design to design the kind of networks and services that those vulnerable neighbours need to get the help they require. Now, here in the UK, it's been impossible not to be heartened by the zest with which, for example, local sewing bees have mass-produced PPE for frontline workers, as indeed have tens of thousands of volunteers, many of them working in the fashion industry or in making theatrical costume designs, by joining the Love of Scrubs movement. Equally heartening has been the surge of community support groups of volunteers who help vulnerable neighbours by shopping for food, collecting prescriptions and walking dogs. I live in a super gentrified area of East London, so I joined up gamely at the start of the crisis. We have more volunteers than vulnerable neighbours around here, so my only contribution, I'm ashamed to say, has been delivering fish and chips on Fish and Chip Thursdays, but at least it cheers people up. And these, of course, are fantastic examples of what are generally not seen as design projects, but really are. They're improvisational, they're instinctive, and they're great examples of design being initiated well beyond the design profession. But nowhere have these community support groups been more active, dynamic and effective than in India, where they have been part of daily life since another terrifying global pandemic, the 1918 Bombay influenza pandemic known as Spanish flu, here in the UK and in most of Europe and the US, that killed well over 14 million people in India in the 2 years after World War I. The death toll would have been much, much higher without the work of what are called SHGs or self-help groups, to which tens of millions of Indian women still belong. And these self-help groups sprang up during the Bombay influenza crisis to make sure that people, particularly in remote rural communities, had the sort of care and practical support in terms of food shopping, collecting medical supplies and so on, that they needed to help them recover from Spanish flu and to protect them from being infected from it. So the SHGs continued after Bombay influenza, and now tens of millions of women all over India are members of these networks, and they're phenomenal community-spirited initiatives, very powerful within their communities and regions. And so, of course, they were in pole position to play a prominent role in helping their communities during the COVID crisis. And in the state of Odisha alone, where this mass production of masks by one SHG, you can see on the screen, 7 million women volunteer for SHGs. And as soon as the state government began contingency planning for COVID-19, one of the first calls that the governor made was to the head of Odisha's SHGs to ask them to help. Now, the response was a model of instinctive and improvisational design and public spiritedness. First of all, an SHG volunteer visited every home in 60,000 villages in Odisha to deliver a leaflet on the official guidelines for isolation, hand washing, social distancing, and so on, to talk them through the rules and to answer questions. They then helped to persuade people to stay at home during lockdown by patrolling towns and villages to make sure that they were, while mobilising volunteers like these to make millions of masks and other PPE, running ration shops to sell food and essential supplies, even running a floating supermarket in another part of India, and delivering meals to people who couldn't leave their homes, as well as cooking them for the destitute. All over the world, other ingenious individuals have also hatched smart design ideas to help us to deal with the pandemic, like this very simple but brilliantly accurate social distancing sign I spotted on the Regent's Canal, which is near my home, while I was walking there during the summer, showing people what 2 meters meant and telling everybody to keep their distance, obviously put there by the occupant of the nearby barge. And of course, it's impossible not to be charmed by these. These are social distancing hats that were made by a school teacher in China. She made an individual customized hat for every single child in her class when they returned to elementary school after lockdown. Now, of course, it must be impossible to tell young kids like these what 2 meters means and why they have to socially distance. So what a fun way of showing them exactly what sort of distance they needed to keep. And also, like many contemporary Chinese design projects, there are also allusions to historic Chinese design, because in the Song dynasty many centuries ago, courtiers in the imperial court wore similar wings on either side, or wands on either side of their hats. And this was because the emperor was concerned that the courtiers were gossiping too much, and this was to stop them. But one of the many perversities of this time is that this zest to contribute to the common good coincides with a moment when, of course, social distancing prevents us from being together. But even so, it's impossible to ignore the ominous aspects that design has exposed or been exposed by the danger of the human and economic turmoil caused by the pandemic, and that Design Emergency has also been investigating. Consider this potentially life-saving hand signal that was designed by the Canadian Women's Federation in the summer to enable people suffering from domestic abuse to silently communicate their plight on smartphones, even if their abusers are nearby. As we all know, domestic abuse has rocketed throughout various lockdowns all over the world. And this is a brilliantly simple but very effective, thoughtful and sensitive and pragmatic way to enable people to signal that they need help, literally by doing that on a smartphone. And take this image. This is one of, for me, the worst, most chilling images of the whole COVID-19 crisis. This is a casino parking lot in Las Vegas. And the people who you can see on the hastily painted rectangular grid are the occupants of a nearby homeless shelter that had been forced to close that day because of a spike in COVID-19 infections. The city council in Las Vegas claimed that it didn't have anywhere to offer proper shelter to all the occupants of the homeless shelter. And so it literally produced these socially distanced grids in the casino parking lot and told them they would spend the night there. The only positive aspect of this hideously cruel scenario is that the media coverage of this shamed Las Vegas City Council to such a degree that it found decent shelter for these unfortunate people the following day. But here in this country, or certainly here in England, I'm sure in Scotland you have higher standards of PPE, but sadly we don't here. This is another sign of design letting people down during the COVID-19 crisis. This is a selfie posted by an English nurse in the Midlands of the damage caused to her face by the masks and visor, the PPE that was supposed to be protecting her while she worked a 13-hour critical care shift. You can see how badly chafed, bruised, and grazed her face is by it. These marks are the proof of bad design, and indeed much of the PPE that is routinely used in English hospitals is so badly designed that it can't be cleaned, let alone recycled. It has to be burnt at vast expense, huge ecological damage and wastage at the end of every day. And these design failures are timely reminders of the urgent need to ensure that our lives will be radically redesigned to make them fit for purpose post-pandemic. And that's the underlying objective of all of Paola's and my work on Design Emergency. We all knew that our lives weren't fit for purpose before COVID-19, as we faced severe problems from the deepening climate emergency and refugee crisis to systemic racism and other forms of inequality, intolerance and injustice, and accelerating advances in potentially ominous digital technologies. And as I explained at the outset, Paola and I saw the exemplary design response to COVID-19 as a golden opportunity to prove its value as a tool that could help us to tackle these challenges and to diffuse the stereotypes of design as a PR and styling tool and something that's focused on surface appearance, not substance. We had both been trying to do this in our work for a very long time, but this seemed a really fantastic opportunity to demonstrate design's power as an agent of change in a completely compelling way. Now, whether or not design will be given the chance to tackle those complex challenges by helping us to forge a new way of life that will be cleaner, fairer, safer, greener and kinder and more responsible after COVID-19 will depend on whether politicians, investors, economists, NGOs and other power brokers can be persuaded to trust it in its new terrain. And to that end, Paola and I have devoted the second and principal phase of Design Emergency to weekly IG Live interviews with people who we believe will be the global design leaders of the future, to hear their ideas and insights into how they can design our lives better. Now, in this series, we've heard from the pioneering social designer, Hilary Cottam, who's currently working in the Scottish borders, or was before COVID, and is desperate to continue her research there afterwards. We've heard from the architect Peter Barber, who plans to diffuse the housing crisis by building decent and affordable social housing, and how the technologist Kate Crawford expects artificial intelligence to evolve for better and for worse. How the gardener and landscape architect Dan Pearson believes we can reconnect with nature in epic projects like this. This is the beautiful Japanese forest that he's designed to last for 1,000 years. We've discussed design's contribution to the next space race with astrophysicist Celia Valdo of the European Space Agency. Last week, Paola interviewed the brilliant architect and material scientist Neri Oxman on the future of making, and only this morning I interviewed Alex Arzen of the Great Green Wall Project, a truly epic design endeavour that plans to reinvigorate a huge swathe of land from one African coast to another, from Senegal to Djibouti, on the southern edge of the Sahara Desert, by cultivating an 8,000 kilometre stretch of vegetation there. Now, whenever a new emergency erupts, we invite two of its design protagonists to discuss its implications and potential solutions, from systemic racism to the Beirut blast to the urgent need for electoral reform in the United States. And all of this, Paola and I hope, will encourage people to be as passionate and enthusiastic about design as we are. We hope to make a conclusive case for design to be empowered to fulfill its true potential in our lives as an agent of change by demonstrating its value in such a complex and daunting crisis at a time when traditional approaches are failing. Design isn't a panacea to any of the problems I've talked about, but we believe it can be one of our most powerful tools to address them in collaboration with relevant specialists from other disciplines, but only, and it's a big if it is deployed intelligently, sensitively, with extreme care and precision. How else will design win the public confidence and political support it needs to be empowered to play a more significant role in our lives without proving its worth? I've got no doubt that design's stellar response to COVID-19 is one of our best chances to do that. And I'm absolutely thrilled that the V&A Dundee has played such a dynamic part of this process and debate with your current exhibition. And I do believe that design will be left better placed to be empowered to realise its potential as an agent of change by the end of this crisis than it ever was before. For all our sakes, let's hope so. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Alice. That was a really wonderful presentation and really interesting talk. We do have a few questions in the chat already, but if anybody else wants to get any questions in, now is the time. But I think I might just go straight to the first question, if that's all right with you, which is from Louise, which is: the design response during the pandemic has changed the way we design, quicker, more collaborative, under pressure. Out of all of these changes in the way in which we design, what do you think will be the most beneficial for society post-pandemic?
Oh, well, I'm going to give a lousy, lazy answer to that question, say all of them. I mean, there was a very interesting editorial in The Economist recently, which specifically looked at home working and said that the way in which people have adapted has accelerated the process of home working by a decade, not just a couple of years. And I think that is true to so many aspects of our lives that have changed fundamentally during this crisis. So telemedicine would be another example. So would events like this, which, you know, it's such a shame we can't be in your beautiful building, looking at the lights on the Tay at night, which is so gorgeous. But events like this can reach a much broader, more diverse audience because they're relayed digitally and undoubtedly will continue to be part of our lives post-pandemic. So as someone who has been passionate about design for so long, I'm just so proud of the design community for the courage, the generosity, the openness and willingness to embrace change that people have shown in their response to COVID-19. So I think all the things that Louise has alluded to have been a fantastic learning experience for the design community. As I pointed out, not all the design responses have worked and we need to learn from those as well, but so many of them have, and it has been a brilliant opportunity to show what design can do. And it's wonderful that the design community has risen to the challenge with such relish.
To the next question then, which is from Julie, which is: how do we document and carry the ethos of togetherness and community spirits that we've seen through the pandemic into the future and ensure that this, along with newfound design values, are retained?
Another excellent question. And I'd like to answer this in two parts. One about collaboration and design and togetherness, and then more broadly about the community, because I do think the whole notion of community spirit, of collectivity, of collaboration has been a huge positive that has come out of this crisis. And within design, collaboration has been an incredibly fashionable word for many years. And many intrepid and innovative designers have really embedded it in their practice in a very positive way. So Hilary Cottam, the social designer I referred to, is an excellent example of that. She's worked entirely collaboratively. She was a social scientist originally, so she's used to working in cross-disciplinary teams of relevant specialists who will work together to focus on different design challenges, but she has chosen to use the design process to do so. And I think it's absolutely essential that the design community sees collaboration in this light. Too often in the past, particularly for-profit commercial design communities, collaboration seemed to be seen as a sort of canny entrepreneurial way of invading the territory of, say, advertising agencies, PR consultancies, structural engineering groups, whatever, and grabbing new business and new terrain for their design disciplines. I think it needs to be seen in a much more open and collective sense. And I'm absolutely convinced that all of our experience of communality, collaboration, and collectivity during this period will have a transformative impact on design culture as it will on other aspects of our lives. And as I said in the talk, many of my favorite examples of improvisational design and of really pragmatic and useful ways of addressing this crisis have been collaborative. So whether that is the mass production of PPEs by people like CTC in Antwerp in Belgium, or the Love of Scrubs movement here, the networks of community volunteers helping their local neighbours. I mean, I would hope that they would follow the pattern of the SHGs in India, and just as the terrible Bombay influenza pandemic in India really was the catalyst for this backbone of Indian communities throughout the country ever since, I would hope that the community volunteer networks that have sprung up locally, regionally, nationally throughout COVID will continue, and that people will really benefit from their experience of volunteering, and that these networks will become embedded as part of our lives. In fact, the local volunteer network that I belong to actually began some years ago with another entirely local crisis, a less dramatic one than COVID-19, but it was a recognition that at that time there were lots of elderly members of the local community who just needed a bit of support or someone to chat to them on the phone to help them more fundamentally or whatever. So I'm sure that will continue. And I think many of the collective gestures we've made, which I would also describe as improvisational, often unknowing design projects. So clapping for carers, I'm really sad that that stops. I felt it was a wonderful way of bringing everyone together and really showing our appreciation and being generous, and showing our frontline workers how much we care for them. The rainbows that are posted in windows. Hassan, who's our local street cleaner, says he feels like the most beloved and popular guy around because all the kids, he's such a lovely man, all chose to say thank you, Hassan, under their rainbows. And that's a lovely way to help someone who could very easily be overlooked for his community contribution. So I mean, everybody will have their own personal observations of this, but I think it's been really valuable and really interesting. And my parents were kids during World War II. My dad was evacuated, but my mum grew up in Manchester then, obviously in the Blitz. Grandpa was a fireman, so obviously very engaged in the war effort. And so I was brought up on all their stories of the Blitz spirit, how we all got through it together, how, collective spirit's the answer to everything. Mum would sing at concerts, God knows what she sounded like at 6 years old, to raise money for Blitz orphans. And it was very much they were a wonderful family. It was very much part of their culture. And I would hope that that kind of spirit, which I found incredibly inspiring and heartening just to hear about as a kid, will again become a much more important and staple part of people's lives.
I think that is pretty much what we have time for. We do have one or two more questions if you're happy to answer them.
Sure.
Okay. We have a question around how you can, if design being such a powerful tool, how you can get buy-in from other kind of organizations and seeing design's role in other organizations? So kind of moving on from that collaborative point.
Well, I think by being great ambassadors for design, and obviously for a writer like me and a curator like Paula and the great curatorial team at the V&A and the V&A Dundee, that's an enormously important responsibility for all of us, because we're really storytellers for design. It's essential that we choose the right stories to tell and that we tell them persuasively and convincingly. And I think all designers who want to collaborate with other fields to prove their worth in other fields need to be convincing and compelling. And there is absolutely no reason why politicians, consumers, local bank managers, whoever, philanthropists, whoever, will stop seeing design purely as a sort of PR or styling tool unless they're convinced otherwise. So it's really down to us to do that.
Okay, I think just one final question then, which is how much, if any, positive or negative impact would you attribute to the conceptual and speculative design responses during the pandemic?
Well, I think speculative design was obviously very dominant within design education and design culture maybe a decade or so ago, and that sort of morphed into conceptual design and also forensic design research projects, which research terrible global emergencies and crises. I mean, there's a great example at the Serpentine Gallery in London, the exhibition Cambio that opened sort of between lockdowns by Andrea Trimarchi and Simone Farrasin, the Italian designers of Forma Fantasma, and that was their investigation of the global timber trade and design's role within it and its impact on the climate emergency, on labour exploitation, and so on. So I think that these tools are being used all the time. And one of the huge benefits of conceptual design and originally speculative design is that it encourages designers to really analyse socio-political, geopolitical, economic phenomena, broader cultural phenomena rigorously, and also to analyse design's role within our lives in what can be a really meaningful sense. So, for example, one of the leading members of the CTC, Creatives Tegen Corona collaborative network in Antwerp, was Dries Verbruggen, who I interviewed about the collaboration on Design Emergency. Now, he and Claire, his partner at Unfold, their studio in Antwerp, have been absolutely at the forefront of conceptual design for many, many years, ever since they graduated about a decade ago. And so they applied their way of thinking about design, the conceptual design process, to putting together the collaboration. And Dries is now doing that in collaboration with Antwerp City Council on yet another collaborative network in the city. So that's a very practical example of where conceptual design can play a very meaningful and constructive part.
Well, I think that just about brings us to a close. All that's really left is for me to thank you, Alice, for such a very interesting and engaging talk with so many wonderful examples of ways that design has got us through what has been a very difficult time. If I can just invite you to turn your video and audio off, I will just wrap up.
Okay, well, if I could say thank you very much to everyone, to Leonie and Nicole and the rest of the team at V&A Dundee for inviting me. It's lovely to be in contact with you again, whether it's digitally or live or whatever. And thank you so much for the great questions and for listening tonight. And do follow Design Emergency. Paula and I try and make sure it's always fun as well as informative. So thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you very much for coming, Alice. It's been lovely to have you. I just have two things to point out to audiences, which is that we do have Alice's Design Emergency collaborator, Paola Antonelli, in conversation with our Young People's Collective at an event on the 4th of March. So please do come along to that. I think we're just about to post the link to it in the chat. And yeah, I think that brings us to an end. Thank you so much for coming and listening and joining. We'd love to have you.